True.
So that was the key step, right? So you see the key step from my father, that actually he was brave enough to go against the conventional idea that trying to, because you see, if you believe in lengthening, right? If you believe in the idea that this is short and this is long, and all that you are doing is either your mechanical actions, either going to, if you stretch it, that means that you're going to make it longer. So that idea that he would be stretching further the already overstretched muscle. Right?
So
So you see this,
by actually by even give it more, go
yes,
with the direction you are activating
yes,
the lengthening muscles.
yes. So you see, by doing this, you would be activating this eccentrically, right? So you see, that would be the
Right.
eccentric
Yeah.
activation. So,
Ah.
and that was this, because, agonists and antagonists are concentric concepts, right?
Ah.
So you see,
Ah.
he was the one who kind of clicked on this point. Okay, so we are going to give it this activation, which has the eccentric label and so on. And that was it. That was a critical step. Now,
But
of course,
he was still talking about muscles, not about the
of
fascia.
course, of course. It was back then, it was the
Yeah,
muscular
sure.
conversation and so on. So anyway, that was the critical step, right? So it's the critical step, and then, that kind of approach brought certain success. I mean, limited, sometimes spectacular, sometimes limited, but it was bringing success.
Nice.
So, and, that was a very, but this is a very critical point, right? Is that this is where you actually starting to look at it as a reciprocal system. So basically where it becomes an equation which has two parts. So if this is excessive, so that means that there is a deficit elsewhere. So if you see that something is really dominant, you stop looking at that dominant part. You stop looking at it as a cause. You stop looking at it as the target. You just start looking at it as your kind of indicator. So spasticity itself becomes the indicator. So in other words, you're looking at it is that it's, and you see, and that also makes a big change, because then you say, okay, if you truly trust, right? Because it's a very big kind of temptation to think that the brain is broken. Say, oh, this is the thing, we had the brain injury, look at that, like there's a huge hemorrhage there, or like an empty part and so on.
It's
So of course,
neurological. We can't accept it's a black box. It's
so,
neurological.
but even, but again, neurology, they try to identify, the particular, right? So you see, the frontal lobe is responsible of this, right? So you see the visual, they even call it, right, the hearing center, the visual center, and so on. But on the other hand, of course, there is also the question of the redistribution. There's also the question of the, that you can't locate there. So it's kind of a competition between those two. But still, the big idea there is that they still want to identify it in a kind of simplified computer and wiring thing. This is the center, this center leads to this. If this center is broken, these functions are missing.
Yeah.
Now,
Very linear approach.
that's very kind of mechanistic in that sense. So, but this takes the next step where you say, you know what? If this is, right, it's just, this is a very important, that's a very important point, right? So it's a kind of all or nothing point. Because for me, that's the way I take it. It's like, look, if this is the brain, which is working in its entirety, and this brain is good enough to run the breathing, to run the digestion, to run the exchange process, and so on. If you look at the total number of functions that this brain is running, it's like 99.99999, which is doing even despite the brain injury.
Sure.
So,
wow.
you are telling me that you have no freaking clue how the brain, like you cannot replace the brain to do all these other functions. And you telling me that the brain does the 99.9% of function, and then at 0.1%, it's broken, it doesn't know what it's doing, and it's sending the wrong signals and so on. I don't buy it.
Nice.
I mean, I don't buy that.
Sure.
So when you're telling me, oh, I have figured out this spot, I don't care about your spot. Replace me give me the whole brain replacement, then then we talk. Otherwise, I find a more consistent concept that the brain actually knows better what it's doing than you are. Because then you have to ask yourself a question: what kind of representation do you guys have about the body? What kind of, let's say, what kind of the accuracy in the interpretation in comparing the so-called regular people to the people with disability? How well you are able to compare them before you start blaming the brain? I know how accurate, how sophisticated is your representation. And your representation is about the muscles stabilizing bones, stabilizing joints. You are measuring scalars, just range of motion and the force, and this is all you have. And based on this, you are blaming the brain. I mean, like, this is ridiculous. This is arrogance.
Yeah,
It's unbelievable arrogance. Let's say
it's hubris. It's the hubris thing.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, guys, okay, so like, if the brain is good enough to run all that, let's see, maybe there are more obvious targets, like how, because, you're trying to figure out what the brain is doing, how well is your representation of everything else, of more obvious things, right? And, and you look, and now, and you see, but it takes, I'm saying this now, but it took me like 30 years to kind of click on the obvious things and say, but they don't even have the skin on the map. They don't even have the skin, on the whole representation. They put it afterwards as an afterthought and kind of, okay, so this just kind of protects you from the elements. So the thing is that this is what it's coming, is that we are so conditioned with those kind of simplistic representations, and that's what I say. And we really, it's what I'm trying to tell people is, this, and we're so ingrained from childhood, right? You see, because basically the idea of the walking zombie has to make you freak out and say, no, I'm not going to watch this movie. This is lunacy. It's impossible, right? So you see, the cartoon with the jumping skeleton is impossible. So you see, because these are the things, but we have kind of take it for granted, So, and that's what I'm saying. So like practitioners who are trying to overcome it, they are dealing with the extreme inertia that it's like everything is colored and permeated by this kind of engineering thinking. And this is what we have to unlearn in that sense, right? And, for me, it's been a lifelong unlearning process. And then it's like, sometimes I look like, how come that I didn't notice that before? Like, isn't it that obvious, right? It's like this system doesn't, like you look embryologically, there's a continuous skin envelope, but we don't have a good language for the representation of the skin, right? We don't have a language for the mechanical representation of the skin. It's completely discarded from our format. Well, why? Are there fields where we have something which is going to give us better language, which could be then re-imported here and then used there? So this is basically, my process. So therefore, if I get back to the early days, I said, what? Look, I approach the body as a black box. And as a black box, how do I take, suppose we don't know anything about what happens inside, right?
That's right.
What we know for sure is that, for example, if the person takes the weight and starts the weightlifting, there's going to be certain change of his physical properties of his tissues. That
right.
We know for sure.
Yeah.
Now, my point is very simple. If we do this, if that happens, so that means that there is a certain work which is being done at the external object, right? And that leads to a certain percentage of the internal transformations. So meaning that if I do certain work from the outside, so there is some work which is being done at the body, at the target area, something has to land there. Something. I don't know how much. I don't know how exactly, but at the very least, if I have something which is deficient, I have to bring some work in and try to channel it in such a way that it will kind of be maximized. So that was my work. That was my whole kind of equation that I was operating on before, right? So you see, and then of course you're looking kind of for the, when you're doing it manually, you're looking for the, for the type of the feel and the response and so on. And, and before, it was long before the balls and so on. It was, of course, first it was all manual. And, the idea is, okay, so what would be the most important functions that we would be able to help? That's kind of where it moved into the, respiratory, digestive, like all this kind of things. So, and then it was, so I had no idea about fascia because basically, look, it's not very much in the textbooks. It's not, like basically, if you look at the rehabilitation textbooks, there's not going to be there. Anatomy, not much. So, and then it was 2004 that I bumped into Myers. I bumped into Thomas Myers. It was, kind of, it didn't last long, those things. It was like international.
Anatomy trains, you mean?
No, it wasn't. It was the International Congress on the Science of Touch. That's how it was called. It was 2004 in Montreal.
Oh.
I was in Montreal, and I said, okay, look, it was there, so I'll go and visit. And there was a talk there. It was 2004, so he made his anatomy trains thing in 2001, so he was already popular. So I go there, and I listen to his lecture. And I buy his DVDs, and the first 2 DVDs are about the fascia thing. And so holy beep, 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 beep. Wow. This is.
Do you mean what he describes, the pathway from the.
You see, I don't care what he describes. For me, it was just a realization, the connective tissue, which is so poorly described and so on and so on. So you actually look at the tangible, you look at some tangible aspects of what you've been doing. So you're looking at the tissues, which is non-contractile, but which is nonetheless alive, right? Because basically that has been, what is the central question of rehabilitation? The central question of the rehabilitation, active versus passive, right? So you see, what is my main trouble in that respect with the world of the standard rehabilitation? Because even, when we try to publish things with Mark Driscoll, who is now became the president of the, fascia, whatever research society, right? So basically the things that we were receiving is that, look, it looks that you are doing the passive techniques. Everybody knows that passive techniques are not working. So we're not even going to waste the valuable time of our viewers to, to study whatever you send. So
what do you mean by passive techniques on the fascia?
Because basically in rehabilitation, you see, you have a very strong distinction. Active versus passive techniques. Passive techniques like stretching, mobilization, and so on. So, basically they go under the label bring massage, right? So you see, these are passive techniques because
so
they're not.
The patient is passive and is.
Yes. So when the person is not doing anything themselves.
Oh, I see.
Or at least they're not actively resisting and so on. So meaning when the contractile elements of the muscles are not being utilized, right? So you see, those are considered passive techniques.
I see.
And those techniques
versus techniques like Feldenkrais, Alexander.
Versus the techniques which are active, when the person is either being moved with some resistance, or when he is being facilitated into movements, or when he is being assisted into movement, or so some kind of self-movement is there.
Okay, I understand.
So that's the central question, right? Because basically, if we look back, because this distinction between the passive and active, it limits us, and it gives us a very, very important distinction. Because if we believe that the only technique that can work predictably is the active technique, that means that we are bound to muscles. We have so that means that no matter what we do, at the non-contractile tissues, at the non-muscular, layers and so on, that means that it will never work. Because they are unable to change in any kind of meaningful, predictable way under the external loads, right? So you see, in other words, the logic is that you can massage, I don't know, the opposite, the spastic muscle, or you can massage the antagonist of this spastic muscle until the end of days, and that is not going to change anything. Right? So
it will just give you a relief for a moment, and then it will
whatever. So, but it's not going to make any fundamental changes because it's the contractile tissue, which is the active tissue, which is the main thing.
Yeah, this is important, that this the dichotomy that you do between the.
So that's the point, and you see, and that's why, and of course, to a great extent, the practitioners in a kind of hands-on field and so on and fashion, so they're kind of not fully, because they're not very crisp in their language, not very crisp in their thinking. So it's kind of all blended. But in their rehabilitation field, it's a very, it's a chop. It's a strong chop, passive, out, like basically not even considered, only active.
Yeah.
So, and that was for me the whole point, right? Is that suddenly you get the substance where you can say, oh, that idea, because you see, that's what, if you bring it to, standard physical therapy, especially let's say 20 years ago, pre-fascia, right? So pre-fascia, if you come to any conversation with the medical community and say, hey, I am trying to strengthen the joint capsule or the ligament, this, you sound like a complete and utter lunatic, not even complete and utter lunatic, worse. You sound worse, because that means that you don't know your anatomy. That means that you
you don't know that the capsule is not fascia.
That's it. So you don't know that the capsule can only be if the capsule is stretched and strained. The only way to settle it is surgically, to stitch it together.
Oh, and the muscles around will not do?
No. I mean, again, you see, once again, the thing is that's why it's considered the passive. So you see, like, for example, the footballer falls and strains his ligament. So what's his problem? Either kind of hope that it will heal and kind of,
but it will
fuse together, or, it has to be stitched surgically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the idea of strengthening the capsule makes no sense in the standard, because it doesn't, something that doesn't have the contractile elements cannot be strengthened. That's it. So, and something that has the contractile elements has to be strengthened actively. So these are the two big things, right? So you see, when we talk about the opposite, that means that we are making a claim which is kind of double negative or double reverse claim. We say something which is not muscle could be strengthened, and B, something that could be strengthened with the techniques which are not active but reactive, right? So you see, in other words, which are sort of, for them, they are passive techniques, right? So you see, they are workout. So they look at the workouts where I bring the concept of the work in.
So you are now talking about the fibrinoblast.
Well, I mean, you see, that's the point. You see, once you realize that, right? So you see, this is where you have to look at this bigger picture, right? So you see, at the end of the day, you come to the point that this is not about the strength, right? So it's not about the strong or weak. It's the concept of the load transfer. How capable is it for the load transfer? But in fact, essential point is that all of them are being their products of the fibroblast activity, right? So you see, that's the essential thing. You don't make fibers strong, right? So you see, you get them being laid in, and then, put together. So, the fibroblast is the one who is responsible of where you're going to get more fibers, less gel, say what kind of proportion, how they're going to work, and so on and so forth. So you see, that's the important thing, is to understand that fundamentally, this is not weak, strong.
Yeah.
This is the question that all of them without exception. So when it comes to the weak, strong fabric-wise, it's being the product of it's the stitching activity of the fibroblasts, which actually matters, the only thing. And the second thing is the activation and the synchronization, which is plugged into the tone, right? So you see the fibroblast is responsible for the material properties, right? And on the other hand, you've got the tone, but the tone, the muscular tone in that sense, is rooted in what could be seen the fascia tone, right? So
I see.
So which is called that's that article about the human resting muscle tone, right? So that's the point, is that you see, that's the thing, is that like the concepts which we have from neurology, from anatomy and so on, they're based on the sharp cut, right? This is the muscle, and then that's it. There's a sharp division. This is the muscle, this is non-muscle. This is the muscle tone, this is the non-tone. Reality is not that sharp, right? So you see, but the moment you get into these gray areas, the moment you actually allow to see that it's a transition, it's a spectrum. One thing, it's a spectrum. The other thing, that it actually makes a flip. It makes a flip and say, oh, why have we built our concept about the muscle fiber? When there is one muscle fiber, and for one muscle fiber, there are thousands of connective tissue fibers. Why do we, base our mathematics of representation? We based our mathematics of representation on the muscle fiber, right? It's like, in a way, if you put it in the social context, it's like, okay, when all these things emerged in the medieval days, you had one, knight on in a shining armor, right? So you see the one knight on a horse, and 100 peasants around, right? So basically, the military back then only counted the knights, right? So you see, they didn't count the peasants. So the same way, their anatomy only counted muscles, never counted, the muscle fibers, never counted the peasants.
And the peasants are the fibers of the fascia.
Yeah. So you see, that's the point. So basically, what we are doing in the fascia perspective is saying, hey, it's time for democracy, from, elitist, totalitarian, from this kind of old social order, where you have at the top, you've got the neuron, which sends a signal, right? So for one neuron, for one axon, right? So for one axon, one signal, you've got, say, tens of muscle fibers. And then for tens of muscle fibers, you have tens of thousands of the fascia fibers. Who is the boss in this system? Why do you think that it's the neuron which is the boss?
It's because it gives the order.
Well, but but you see, the thing is that it's a system where the execution depends on where it's going to go. It don't care about the order, the order comes, but then the practical reality is going, the outcome, the final execution is the one that goes through the connective tissue fibers. This is where the end point.
So the peasants, and can I ask you something? That
yes,
in inflammation processes, the fibroblasts go hey. They grow. They grow sometimes in chaotic way. They create deformations.
But you see, again, now we move to the other part, right? So you see, then we have to put this whole thing again into the larger context of the thermodynamics, right? Because you see, it was like 12 years ago, I think. It was a great lecture. It was, no, 2009, it wasn't 9 or 12, I don't remember. I think in 9 it was, in Amsterdam, yeah. So it was this great lecture. It was, his name, Moshe Solomonov. So he's actually, he's from, well, obviously he's Jewish, but he is gee, I don't remember. I think he's one from Colorado.
Mm.
So, and he was giving a lecture there on the inflammation, right? So you see inflammation and the micro injuries. And that was, his point was that, you see, like, he's working for the labor department or something like this. I say, look, a person who sits in the office every day experiences several hundred micro injuries to the muscles of the lumbar spine.
That's right.
So now the thing is, what is a micro injury? Micro injury is something which gets self-healed within the space of 24 to 36 hours.
Mm.
If that's the case, then it's a micro injury. If it belongs to the cycle, then inflammation is information, right?
Mm.
Because basically, in other words, for the brain to distribute the resources, the fact is, it doesn't really know what's happening there. So basically, unless there is inflammation, there's not going to be information which is going to report, okay, so we need some kind of extra people who are going to fix the potholes on the road, right? But when you move into the domain of the children with the CP, it's also another part but everything has a cost, right? So you see, that means that it's also the cost, fixing. If you need to fix 5 potholes, it's easy. If you need to fix 10 potholes, if you need to fix 100 potholes, but on the other hand, if at the same time you have 100 potholes, but if you had, for example, a water pipe which has broke through, right, or a fire, so that means that there are resources which are going to go into that, right, because it's a limited resources, and they're not going to go into the fixing the potholes. But if those potholes they maintain for longer than that, that means that the inflammation is just going to increase. So you see, that's another part which we again talk about. The inflammation is actually it's a fundamental process. And if we get back to this and say, hey, there must be a reason why there is a deficit of the self-regeneration, right? So this is
I'm asking about the inflammation because in collagen, there is collagen 2 and collagen 3. So what dictates if it will go to the ordered collagen or it will go to the hectic one?
I have no idea, right? And my point is very simple. I have no idea, and I don't even want to know. All I need.
But your work is about activating the fibers.
Yeah. So my point is very straightforward. I am outside. So what am I able to do? I want to identify the areas. My point is that if something is being excessively active, excessively dramatic, excessively, excessively going excessively into the quick and simple way, that means that it's an emergency procedure. It's an emergency procedure. It's a mobilization. It's an overload, right?
That's right.
My job is to help with the distribution. I want to find the areas which are off the map. That means that somebody is working too hard.
I see.
And instead of punishing the one who is working too hard, instead of trying to slow him down and so on, the logic is very simple. We go elsewhere. We use the spasticity as the indicator.
Yeah.
The brain is smart enough. If the brain chooses the spasticity to say, well, okay, the brain knows what it's doing.
So how do you locate the areas that are not working?
That's very simple.
How?
Again,
How
this
simple?
is where.
Can you give me an
example?
Can you give a concrete example? If someone is with this dystonia and
okay, but that's the periphery, right? So you see, again, then okay, let's take the hand, right? Let's take the hand. The same thing. You ask yourself as a first question. You have at least 27 bones, right? So if you talk about the
The leg,
27 bone.
the foot, the foot.
Well, the foot, the hand, right? So, you know, and then your question is, what are the weakest elements there? So what are the weakest elements which are not working in the hand? And you are going to find out that, you know, the fingers are disconnected, the entire palm is folded, right? So you see all these elements, you know, let's say, which is, so, you know, basically what has to separate and connect those elements, they're not connected very well. So you want to feed the maximum distribution. The logic that I go with is always super simple. How do we get the maximum distribution of loads there? And of course, on a tactile level, it's very simple, right? So you see, you know, you are able to distinguish, you know, as a practitioner, you're able to distinguish the level of the tone, right? So you see something which is hyper or hyper, right? So you see some kind of, you know, you get the responses, you get the general idea of the connectivity, right? So you see, like, you having the ball with you, right? So you see,
Yeah.
it doesn't take much of a genius, you know, to figure out, right? Say, okay, so this level, if it's sinking under the basic load, and, you know, that means that it's going to, and then, you know, if the person is trying to sit and it kind of folds, you know, collapses under the load, well, what do I want to do? I want to improve the distribution. If I want to improve the distribution, if this kind of layer, for example, the abdominal wall, right? If it's already badly distributed there, right? So you see, if you have particular weaknesses, let's say, of the deep layers of, say, transversus abdominis, right? And the person is kind of, you know, all just doing the more superficial, let's say, external obliques, right? So what is my goal? I'm taking the external element, equalizing the tensions, and then just bringing the distribution. You know, I'm using this as the load, right? So you see, I'm neutralizing the response on the surface and maximizing the thing through. That's it.
Let's talk about the diaphragms. The left diaphragm is very small versus the right one. It means that many people, they have this tendency to be very condensed and very knitted in the rib cage, in the right side, like, you know, the side bending would be very easy in the left, the spread of the rib cage, and the lateral flexion in the when you turn to this, it will be more knitted, more congested. So, and the breathing pattern is very different in the right and in the left. So, and therefore, you know, it's the whole kinematic chain, the internal oblique, the transversus abdominus in the left side, the internal, the adductor in the left thigh would be, they all would be weaker relatively to the right. So you would take this.
Okay, but look, again, you see, the moment we talk about the differences between left and right? So you see, I stop the conversation right there and say, guys, what we're able to do it, we don't know if it's the right which is too weak or it's the left which is too strong,
That's
right?
Very,
or if it's, you know,
that's very true.
So my point is very simple. Let's get the maximum distribution through the entire thing, right? So you see, if I find, you know, like, that would be my first logic. What would be the system which is above the right and the left there, right? That would be the monotorso. Okay, let's get something comparable with the torso and let's get the load. Afterwards, let's, you know, of course, we are able to zoom in, right? And basically, what we'll be thinking, okay, so if the distributions are uneven, so typically, yes, people collapse on the left side, but you see, in other words, you know, you are talking about the ease of movement, I talk about the ease of collapse, right? So you see, people collapse on the left side easier than they collapse on the right side. So my point is, okay, the same story. What do I want to do? Now I'm taking this subcompartment, and within this subcompartment, I would want to maximize the loads again. You know, effectively, it's like stitching, you know. Look, if you imagine a basket, right? So you see a basket which has a kind of, you know, which is uneven. You have there some of those elements which are woven densely, and some of them there is a hole. So the point is that when it's overstretched into a hole, you can't catch it, because the moment you try to do anything yourself, you're always going to activate the dominant part.
That's right.
What do? I believe that if there is behind that, right, so there is always a common level where these both levels belong to. So that's what I'm doing. I'm taking the element, like in that sense, I'm using the viscoelastic ball with a membrane which is not committed, right? Soft ball means that the membrane has different potential settings, right? It's not committed to a particular thing. That's the difference, right? So if it's inflated, it's already committed.
But it's malleable. It's very.
That's it. So but I'm going to apply the loads until it kind of self-connects.
What I don't understand is how do you yourself said that we don't know which side is the weaker, the left or the right.
See, once again, that's why if you want to figure out what you want to do, you have several logics, right? So you see logic number one. If you don't know, go up.
Yeah, means to the neighbors. You go to the neighbors.
Go up means you go to the level which encompasses both of them. That's the first logic, right?
And what do you check there?
Then you just look at them. You see, both of them they belong to the total torso. So you take a larger item and you work at the total torso. You want the response which is going to be uniform throughout the total torso.
And then if you decide that some part of the torso is weak, you apply.
Then you just, then your logic, first logic, when you identify something which is being too weak, right? And being too weak means that it doesn't hold the compression loads very well, right? So you see, that means that it has a tendency to collapse and buckle, right? So you see, therefore, you always first, because, you see there are sides which are tense, stiff, restraining, and so on, and there are sides which buckle, right? So you see, my point, you always go for the ones which are dealing, with the buckling. And the same thing, you blend the tension and you facilitate the distribution.
So you put the soft thing under the one that buckles?
And then eventually you load it gradually until it becomes dense. It's soft in the beginning.
So the idea is to generate the fibroblasts.
You see, once again, when we have the understanding of the fibroblast, it's helpful, right? Because basically it gives us this whole idea. I used to call it a tensional common denominator, right? I want to find the common denominator between the two elements, right? So you see, one element is weaker than the other, right? So you see, what do? I use the external pace, right? So you see, I use the external element, which I know has uniform distribution, right? So you see, this has a uniform distribution. It's manufactured to have a uniform distribution. It doesn't have a hole. So if I find a hole on the body, if I find something which is kind of that weird, I'm going to connect and integrate it in such a way that I'm going to have the uniform tension. That's it.
So in CP children, you can see it very easily. How in adults you observe, you notice what is happening there?
The same. It's very easy. The easiest part to see it is that when you are using nowadays the simple tools, right? But look, we have this extra conversations with this in our in that course on the tensegrity assisted therapy with Mariana that we did like this year, right? So you see, I shown people there that it's actually very simple. You take the mini video of yourself. Nowadays the videos are easily available. You do the simple moves, right? So you see, just whatever, tilt, rotate, and so on. The moment you split it with more than 5 frames per second and start looking, you are going to see the elements where it's uneven.